Okay, I think it's good. There's no funny intro today. I'm just going in regular. So welcome back to the seventh installment in the series of going over the new covenant. We've already gone through a lot of the groundwork. We've already gone through the main text. We've already gone through some of the hermeneutical problems and concerns. And now we're in the third installment of the text people use in the New Testament to prove that the church is under the new covenant in some way. And as you can tell from the title, we're dealing with 2 Corinthians 3, verse 6, called Ministers of a New Covenant. And now it's by me, and it's adapted from George Gunn's chapter. He basically writes a lot of the book, as well as Christopher Cone and David Gunn. But let me check something. Okay, seems good. All right, so for starters, we have to understand that this is a really huge deal for dispensationalism. If there is overlap between the church and Israel's covenants, then we have to ask ourselves a question: have we built on sandy foundation? Have the critiques from non-dispensationalists been valid? Have the outside critiques had weight to them? When they basically say that we're inserting our theology into the text. 2 Corinthians 3:6 in particular is a huge battleground passage for the last few decades on this issue in the New Covenant, and it's probably for good reason. It's probably the most quoted text that people, either covenantalists or even dispensationalists, to prove that the church is under the New Covenant in some way. Now, similar to Romans 11:17 that we did last time, understanding this text is going to actually require a pretty good overview of the book of 2 Corinthians as a whole, which is pretty good in terms of understanding the book of 2 Corinthians as a whole, because this will probably help in your study when examining the other related passages. And as, of course, just like Romans 9 to 11, you can only understand this dispensationally. Not that being a dispensationalist is required, but that you would probably have a less functional understanding, a less dynamic one, if you took them non-dispensationally. Or, of course, you might come to false conclusions. All credit belongs to the original authors, the author of this section, and the general editor of it, which is Christopher Cone. All right. So this is kind of a heavy screen, but basically you in the audience probably consciously or subconsciously line up with one of the 5 primary views of the New Covenant and 2 Corinthians 3:6 as a whole. So we're just going to briefly go over them. Replacement theology, which is just what we're calling it. I know that they don't call it replacement theology. They call it supersessionism, but that's just a helpful term for us now. The church entirely fulfills the new covenant. National ethnic Israel has been superseded by the church, which is a true spiritual Israel. The church ministers the new covenant by fulfilling the Great Commission. Dispensational view number 1, the church, by fulfilling the Great Commission, accomplishes a partial fulfillment of the new covenant, but the complete fulfillment awaits the renewal of national Israel and the millennial kingdom. So it's still premillennial. Although some replacement theologians are premillennial, but that just happens to be the case. It's not necessary for the system. Dispensational view number 2, the church does not partially fulfill the new covenant in the Great Commission, but it does participate in some of the blessings of the new covenant, which are deemed as spiritual blessings. The third dispensational view is that the church has its own new covenant, distinct from what will be established with the new covenant in Jeremiah 31 for Israel. The church ministers this covenant via the Great Commission. And the dispensational view number 4 is that the church is not directly related to the new covenant in any way, but is related to the mediator and blood of the new covenant. It does not participate in any of the blessings, and it especially does not minister the new covenant in the Great Commission. So that is us. And just as a summary for this section, you have 5 views, and it basically goes: replacement theology, the church overtakes Israel. You have one dispensational view where the church kind of fulfills it in a little bit, right? Like it partially fulfills Jeremiah 31. The dispensational view number 2 is that it doesn't really partially fulfill it, but in some way it still partakes of the blessings, even though it doesn't fulfill it. The third view is that, of course, two new covenants, so it's not even related to Jeremiah 31. And the fourth view is that single covenant Israel only, pretty simple, where not in any way related, not directly or indirectly. Now, we're just going to categorize the views. There's two ways you can categorize this. You can either categorize this as the covenant theology views, which is view number 1, or the dispensationalism views, which is views 2 to 5. Or if you want something even simpler, you have the church has some participation, either partial or full, in views 1 to 4, or the church has no participation in the new covenant, which is view number 5. And we're going to refer to these views from here on as replacement, partial fulfillment, participation, two covenants, no relationship. If you want a deeper dive into these things, there are previous installments where we go into the quotes people have said about these views. But for now, we're just going over the passage itself. But just as a review, who believes what? I mean, you got to categorize like which dispensationalist views which one. Again, this is a heavy screen, but the idea is basically this. Darby is held to be the first systematizer of dispensational thought, and most people say that he held to the no relationship view. But is this accurate? Because J.D. Pentecost quotes him in Things to Come saying, the gospel is not a covenant, but the revelation of the salvation of God. It proclaims the great salvation. We enjoy indeed all the essential privileges of the new covenant, its foundation being laid on God's part in the blood of Christ, but we do so in the spirit, not according to the letter. The new covenant will be established formally with Israel in the millennium. So he seems to suggest here that, yes, the church is, there is an informal establishment of the new covenant in some way, but there's a formal establishment. And he seems to say that we partake of the essential privileges of the new covenant. I don't know exactly what that means. He doesn't expound on it, unfortunately. But I think that, and from what this author, George Gunn, said, if you actually take all of Darby's thoughts into consideration here, he probably most closely aligns with the no relationship view, which is Israel only. Early on, Ryrie and Walvoord, you actually wouldn't know this, they actually held to the two covenants view. But later on, they moved in the direction of the participation view. And so it's similar to most modern dispensationalists. So basically, you have, and because you see it in some of their writings, especially Walvoord and Schaeffer, where they believe that one new covenant was for Israel, one new covenant was for the church. I don't think it's exegetical, but that's what they attempted to do. Most progressive dispensationalists, like Bruce Ware and Craig Blazing, hold to the partial fulfillment view. And up front, as far as today, the no relationship view, in my opinion, is the most textually supported from the Old Testament, and it maintains the consistent distinction between the church and Israel. Oh, and hey, what's up, Doki? Hopefully you're entertained by this. However, the battle must be fought on exegetical grounds rather than theological preference. So just as a summary statement, Darby held single covenant Israel only. Ryrie and Walvoord held to the two new covenants view. Most progressive dispensationalists hold to the partial fulfillment view, and most regular dispensationalists hold to the participation view. So that's basically how it goes. Oh, and hey, Janet, listening from the Philippines, that's cool. The significance of 2 Corinthians 3:6. So I have this verses here on the side. Dispensationalism versus amillennialism. So on the top, you got this complex, eschatology chart. You got the church, and then the kingdom, and then the world, and then all that stuff. But then you just have an explosion, which is facts, IMO. So what's the significance of 2 Corinthians 3:6? Almost every other New Covenant reference in the New Testament is either in an eschatological or a Jewish context. Specifically, the New Covenant mentions almost always refer to a future messianic period of people obeying and glorifying God through their obedience. And this comes from John Master and his comments about it. Now, if we allow 2 Corinthians 3 to present a present fulfillment of that, then we kind of have to call all these other scriptures that talk about the new covenant, especially Jeremiah 31, Isaiah 59, 27, etc., into question, right? And at that point, I'm just suggesting, why don't we just become amillennialists, guys? Because it's already being fulfilled spiritually. It's spiritual Disneyland. Um, Now, progressive dispensationalists who kind of want to take a middle view, they actually place a lot of significance on this verse as well. And so Paul Thorsell, who's progressive, states that it presents a formidable reason to regard the new covenant as partially fulfilled or inaugurated. However, is he accurate in this assertion, or have we jumped the gun without looking at the full context? And so basically, people have placed this huge emphasis on this one passage, 2 Corinthians 3:6, and it's kind of out of place in terms of most new covenant references in the New Testament, and especially even in the Old Testament. And so you got to question, okay, why exactly is it placed the way that it is? And why do people stress so heavily on this verse? Because what does it exactly say, right? So for the rest of this study, we're going to look at 6 questions that George Gunn, the author, poses in this chapter so that we can understand Paul's statement. Now, these 6 questions are: number 1, is ministers of a new covenant, which is diakonos, kainos, diathekes, an objective or descriptive genitive? Question 2, what is the referent to us, hemas? Question 3, what is the context of this statement? And I bolded that because that's an extremely important question that is going to take a while to get into. Question 4, is there significance to the fact that covenant, diathekes, is anarthrous? Anarthrous just means it does not contain a definite article, right? That's all it means. Question 5, what was the state of theological development when Paul wrote 2 Corinthians? How well developed was Paul's concept of the church as an entity separate from and distinct from Israel? And the final question, why would Paul be referring to a passage from the Hebrew scriptures when addressing a largely Gentile church? So these 6 questions are specifically for this verse, but we can basically frame this as, what does the language mean? What does the us mean? What's the context of it and as a whole? What's the significance of the specific words? What's the theological development? And why does Paul even make this reference in the first place? So getting to the first question, is it an objective or descriptive genitive? So this gets a little bit, we're going to go into a lot of heavy Greek for the rest of it, but hopefully I can articulate what's going on. This might be the most fundamental question that we're going to try to prove from the rest of the study. If it's objective, we can phrase it as those who minister the new covenant, right? Pretty straightforward. In other words, the new covenant is the content of their ministry. That's what they're ministering to other people. However, if we take it as a descriptive genitive, we could phrase it as a new covenant like ministry. And so this would point not really to the content or what he's saying, it's point to the character and the operation of the ministry. And so the closest parallel of the genitive that uses ministers, which is diakonos, is actually 2 Corinthians 11:15, which is ministers of righteousness, or diakonos. I think it's what's the word? It's dikaiao, right? Well, that's justified. Dikaiosune. We would not argue that they actually minister righteousness. These are false teachers. Only that they appear to conduct themselves righteously, but they're masquerading as such. And we know this because it says similarly that Satan is an angel of light, which is angelos photon, something like that. However, parallel structure does not necessarily indicate identity, right? So we're not making that fallacy. So we have to find some other exegetical ground for our conclusions. But again, this is a pretty good reason to believe that it is that it's descriptive rather than objective genitive, because if it's descriptive genitive, then I think the case is closed, that this is not talking about present fulfillment of the new covenant. This is just talking about a comparison to the new covenant. But again, that's what we're going to try to establish in the rest of the study. Not the content of it, but the character. Now, then we have a second question, right? Who is the us? And I got the Spider-Man here because they're all pointing at each other. right? If anyone remembers that meme. And so, who is us? And so most people see the us, quote unquote, that Paul says he has made us able ministers of a new covenant as, those who preach the gospel, right? Those who are sent on the Great Commission. And so this is to administer the new covenant blessings to unbelievers. Again, that points to an objective genitive use. However, who are the possible options that we have? There's actually 5 options, right? It could either reference Paul alone, and so it's an editorial use of the first person plural. It could reference Paul and Timothy and possibly Titus with the team, so they're kind of going along for the ride. It could specifically be Paul and the Corinthians as fellow laborers, like in 2 Corinthians 6, 1 and 2. It could reference the apostles as a whole, although this is less likely because he's not really focusing on the apostles like Peter and James and John, but they focuses on inaugurating the new covenant. Or it could reference all believers via the fulfillment of the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 19 to 20. So again, people assume one particular view of the first person plural, and they put their theology into it. They don't consider the other options, and that's why they come to these hasty conclusions on the new covenant. So we have 5 options here. So continuing on, we actually should note like some of the first person indicators from chapters 1 to 3. And it actually gets pretty interesting because he switches often between I, first person singular, and me, and we versus and us, which is first person plural. So in verses 1 to 13a in chapter 1, he comforts us, which includes Paul and Timothy, but he makes a distinction between those who are comforted, probably the Corinthians. In 13b, he starts as we write nothing else. And so he switches to make it personal. I hope you will understand. So he addresses them in a very personal manner, right? In verse 14, we return to a default plural Paul used since verse 1. In verses 15 to 17, Paul switches to the singular in the past tense to tell of his canceled plans to visit Corinth, which is, again, a major theme of why Paul was criticized. Up to this point, the plural has been the default, but will now primarily go to the singular. And so from verses 18 to 22, we return to the plural. It specifically references Paul, Silas, and Timothy, the people that are with Paul. Verse 23, it's a plural. It goes with 15 to 17. It's a past singular reference to his canceled plans to visit Corinth. In verse 24, it's a return to the plural with a gnomic present time frame. And he says, we lord it over and you stand firm. So it's just a timeless truth, not anything special there. In verses 1 to 10, he talks more about his canceled plans to visit Corinth. And he specifically accompanied it with a singular and past tense, like we saw before. Verse 11 is just a general applicable statement to everyone. It's plural, but it doesn't say anything about Paul or his team. In verses 12 to 13, it's a default singular that Paul discusses the rest of his past plans. In verses 14 to 3:6, Paul begins a discussion of his past plans to an end, and he begins an extended section of metaphors to describe his ministry. And so the reason for the switch to the plural here compared to 2:11 is different. The first person plural in chapter 3, verse 3 is in contrast with the second person plural. And so there's no contrast season in 2:11. And so the use of the plural in this section is to depict the ministry that's conducted specifically by Timothy and Titus and himself, which is in contrast with the false teachers. And so this, more than the previous question, supports the conclusion that of a new covenant is a descriptive rather than objective genitive. And so basically the reason that the author and I go into all of this plural, singular, it's just to establish that Paul is not really focusing that much on the we as Christians. He's focusing on the we as the ministers, right? The apostles and the people that are coming along with him. And so he makes a distinction between we and you. So I don't think that it's referencing all Christians when it says he has made us ministers of a new covenant. It's referencing Paul specifically. But then we got a question. Okay, that's great and all. But what's the actual context of this statement? So there's a rule in hermeneutics called context, context, context. And 2 contextual issues affect the interpretation of 2 Corinthians 3:6. Number 1 is the literary style of this section, And number two is the topic Paul is discussing. So we're going to go into both of those aspects of it here. But for the first one, we have the literary style. And so a major theme that most critics recognize, most commentators recognize of Second Corinthians, is that it's meant to be a defense of Paul's gospel ministry in face of many criticisms. Like that is a huge, and I mean, yeah, it's talked a little bit in First Corinthians. You see that in chapter 8 to 10, how he's abusing his power as an apostle, that kind of stuff. But it's really amped up in Second Corinthians, probably because a lot of time went on, you know. And so these criticisms mostly seem to stem from Paul's failure to visit Corinth as planned, which was seen as a vacillation. He's unsure on his part. But then it went to criticisms about Paul's conduct, right? His character, his motives, even his particular sins. And so from 2:14 to 5 verse 5, Paul most people don't recognize this. He employs 8 metaphors to explain why he conducted the way that he did. And most of them are based off of the Old Testament imagery. And I posit, as well as the author, that they might possibly all be from just Jeremiah 30 to 32, right? Those 3 chapters, which is very important. Now, the first 4 images. Number 1, we have the triumphal procession, which you see that's a Roman procession. The odor of life and death, which that is interestingly goes back to the response of the gospel in believing or accepting it as or rejecting it, as far as my personal opinion. You have the letters written on stone versus letters written on heart, which is, it's just something that I got from Google. And then we have new covenant ministers, which is referenced by Paul. You have the veil removed. Now, this is clearly a bride that has her veil removed. That's not exactly what's going on there. It's something slightly different, but it's still relevant to the discussion, a good imagery. It's the light of creation, 4:6. We have earthen vessels in 4:7. And we have earthly versus a heavenly house, right? And so you're probably asking at this point, okay, professor, I'm not a professor, but let's just say I was. That's great and all. But what does it actually mean, right? Those are great images, but what do they actually mean? So getting into the exact details, it can be confusing since there's different interpretations. But metaphors 3 to 8 seem to appear specifically from Jeremiah 31 to 32. But in the first and second ones, however, there's nothing explicitly from Jeremiah to suggest it. They possibly come from the Babylonians leading the Israelites to captivity. And so some go to death, and others wait a future restoration of Israel. And it's also possible that Paul had in mind the contemporary Roman victory procession. So again, these are possible options of why Paul used these imagery. The third and fourth metaphors are clearly drawn from Jeremiah 31. The fifth and sixth metaphors are probably a reference to the Mosaic law and the veil over Moses' face, and it blocked the light of God's glory. The seventh metaphor probably comes from the clay jar or the earthen vessel in Jeremiah 32, 10 to 14. The eighth metaphor is probably taken from the houses destroyed from the Babylonians and later rebuilt under the new covenant. That's in Jeremiah 32, 29 and Jeremiah 42 to 44. And so these 8 metaphors, we don't exactly know where a lot of them came from, but we can probably suspect what Paul had in mind when he was writing this, especially since it continues on in a particular thought. So yeah, honestly, it seems like a lot of them just come from Jeremiah, right? Now, here's what it doesn't mean, right? What it doesn't mean, whenever you're employing a metaphor or a figure of speech or something meant to illustrate something, you're illustrating something via a metaphor, a similarity, but that doesn't mean fulfillment of it, right? For instance, you could say, he says, you are our letter written on hearts, but he does not say that Jeremiah's prophecy of the law written on Israel's heart is fulfilled. In fact, that actually wouldn't make sense because God's law is God's law. It's not God's people, right? So clearly, we're not talking about fulfillment here. We're talking about comparison in specifically conduct, right? And so Jeremiah's imagery from the Old Testament is a pretty suitable figure to help describe his ministry. And so the Similarly, the inability to discern gospel ministry is likened to the veil that covered Moses' face. But that doesn't mean that the veil is fulfilled by his opponents. It's a good comparison for what's happening to his opponents, but that doesn't mean that that specific scripture is fulfilled every time someone rejects Paul, right? That wouldn't make sense. And so the new covenant is a suitable way to describe what is going on with Paul's ministry. But in order to understand the point of these metaphors, we have to focus on the topic of this section. That's part 2. And if you've, some of you have seen, John Wick, right? And in John Wick, there's 4 movies. I watched all of them. Some of them in the theaters. John Wick is hunted by a lot of these guys chasing him around and trying to kill him, right, for a bounty. And that's kind of what's going on with Paul. People are just trying to deliver him over to death, and man, Paul has had a rough day, man. That's got to suck. We've already identified the literary style of this section, but there are still some nagging questions to answer. For instance, we got to ask, who are Paul's opponents? What is his defense? Why does he argue the way that he does? How one identifies Paul's opponents has a serious impact on the meaning of 2 Corinthians 3:6. So most commentators, and you'll generally see this if you go to like Bible study tools or Enduring Word Ministry or something like that, they'll usually say that Paul's opponents are Judaizers. And so you can kind of see the correlation, right? The connection people make. And so if we're going to say that it's Judaizers, then we would say that his opponents are trying to enforce Mosaic legislation. And so therefore, Paul would be arguing that we minister the new covenant as a replacement. So that's pretty straightforward. That seems to strengthen an objective genitive view. But if you didn't know this, throughout the years, 2,000 years that Paul has wrote that letter, there's actually been 19 different interpretations of the opponents in 2 Corinthians. Adopting one view of it is pretty simplistic, especially since there's at least 2 sets of opponents. And so in chapters 1 to 9, the focus is really more on the Corinthian congregation. And so that's more of a Greek philosophical worldview. And so, again, in a Greek philosophical worldview, the issue is not content, as we've established before. It's conduct, all right? And so the outsiders outside of the Corinthian congregation is not really dealt with until chapters 11 to 13. And so basically the idea is that how you identify Paul's opponents has a huge impact on how you identify the book as a whole, and especially on the new covenant. And so helping to identify who the opponents are will help us understand the meaning of Paul's metaphors here. And so when it comes to the second group, the outsiders, a Judaizing background for the second group would probably be 2 Corinthians 11:4, where it says another gospel. And so that's the exact same construction as Galatians 1:6. People that move away from the gospel, which is not another, something like that. And it also says in Hebrews 11:20 or 2 Corinthians 11:22, are they Hebrews? Are they Israelites? Right? But this doesn't reference a Judaizing background necessarily, but it's really more of a Jewish background, which is to say, it's not saying that the content is Judaizing, but that the people are just Jewish, right? That they don't have to be Judaizers to be Jewish. And in fact, 2 Corinthians 10:2-3 help us identify even further who this criticizing group is. Some regarded Paul as walking according to the flesh. Now, that doesn't mean sin, right? That's not what that means. It's more so that they're judging his walk and using their flesh as a standard of punishment. So they're judging him according to the flesh, right? Specifically, they judge him as coming up short in particular physical areas. They say he's sick, he's poor, he's ineloquent, he doesn't have good speech, etc. And so Paul does admit, yes, he walks in the sphere of the flesh. He's a fleshly, physical man, right? But he doesn't conduct his conduct according to the flesh. He conducts it according to the Spirit. And so it's probably the case that his second group of critics are of a diaspora Jewish origin, right? And so they have more pagan philosophical perspectives. And so this is again aided by the fact that we don't have mentions of typical Judaizing that we see in Galatians, right? Like circumcision, Jewish diets, Jewish holiday observances, that kind of stuff. And so, again, we're not focusing in the second group. as something like Judaizers or just people trying to institute the Mosaic Law. That's not what's going on. It's more people that have a pagan background, probably from the diaspora, and they're criticizing Paul according to how he conducted himself, not according to his gospel ministry, anything like that, right? So now, okay, that's great and all, right? We established who the second group is, but what's the first group, right? So when we actually look at the first group, we see some interesting notes. The critique of Paul's ministry is that, number one, he failed to visit Corinth as planned. Number two, he was not a skilled orator. Number three, he was physically weak in his appearance. Number four, he had not been financially successful, and he didn't charge a philosopher's fee. And number five is that he had been in numerous hardships and even in jail. Now, as for Paul's defense of himself, he says he conducted himself with sincerity and purity, not by fleshly wisdom, but God's grace. Number two, he didn't make absolute statements of yes, yes, no, no, according to the flesh, and he trusted in God's plan, right? And James even says that if just let your yes be yes and your no be no, yet lest you fall into condemnation. Number three, God has sealed Paul with the Spirit and anointed his team for ministry. Number four, the Corinthians themselves are proof of God's ministry, even though they don't have physical letters of commendation. And number five, Paul was made an able minister of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And so these criticisms actually don't express a Judaizing worldview, right? They don't even express a content worldview. They express a Greek philosophical worldview. And specifically, they didn't think that Paul had the means to be a successful philosopher, right? He didn't have the physical stature, the Greek god body, the good oratory skills, the healthy life. He had trouble in his life, that kind of stuff. And so this is a fleshly standard of judgment, and it's not a spiritual standard of judgment, right? They're glorying in the flesh, but not in the heart. And so it's kind of the same as his Jewish opponents. And so what was Paul's reply? It wasn't the message that he preached. In fact, we don't know the message that he preached exactly, and unless we get into 2 Corinthians 5, which is the ministry of reconciliation. But what we know is that with the conduct of the ministry, okay? And so the contrast between the letter and the Spirit is about how he conducted himself, how he behaved and judged himself according to his spiritual standard. And so if Paul would use the Hebrew scriptures to support this idea, the best comparison is Jeremiah's new covenant, right? And so again, putting all these 8 metaphors together, we can come up with something that looks like this, right? Number one, the triumphal procession. Weakness in physical appearance may not meet up with fleshly standards, but like the children of Israel led away into captivity, both the godly and ungodly were led away. And so therefore, physical appearance is not a sign of godliness. Number two, the odor of life and death. The presentation of the captives were accompanied by offering incense to pagan gods. The smell signified life for some, but death for others. And so too, Paul did not physically look well, but his message was powerful for those who believed it, and death for those who rejected it. Number three, the letters written on hearts. Paul's critics had put great emphasis on their outward appearance in commendatory letters. However, just like the new covenant put superiority to the internal affairs of the heart, so too did Paul's commendation come from the transformed lives of the Corinthian believers. At least the ones that aren't fornicating all the time, right? And then number four, the old covenant focused on outward confirmation's legalistic standards, but Paul's standard was more to that of the new covenant. He failed to keep a written itinerary of his plan to visit Corinth because he was sensitive to the Spirit's leading in him, right? In Acts 16, 6-10, and God's sovereign direction. Now, if we continue onward, 5, the veil removed. After spending much time in God's presence, Moses reflected God's Shekinah glory, but the Israelites could not bear it. They requested to see Moses with a veil so as to avoid seeing God's glory. And so in the same way, Paul's critics desired to see his fleshly, outward, philosophical success. But Paul desired to show his unveiled face, right? His true self, so that they would not see the outward man that perishes, but the inward man that reveals the glory of God. Number 2, the light of creation. Glory, light, and appearance are things pertaining to God, not pertaining to creation. The creation exists to glorify God. And so Paul, as part of God's creation, seeks not to be noticed for his appearance, but to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Number 3, earthen vessels. Right before the Babylonian captivity, Jeremiah purchased a field of Anathoth, placing the deed in an earthen vessel or clay jar. It did not need to be ornamental or costly because it treasured what was inside. And so in the same way, Paul is an earthen vessel, a physical body that's going to perish, that's cracking up at the seams. But the impressive part is not on the outside, but it's the message on the inside, which is the message of hope. 4, the earthly and the heavenly house. The coming of the Babylonians would destroy the cities of Judah, just as God promised. But he also promised to rebuild them in the new covenant. And so in the same way, Paul's body would waste away, an embarrassment to the Corinthians, but the symbol of a future glorification in the resurrection. And so that ends our 8 metaphors, at least the way that the author expounds on them, and which is actually pretty interesting. I would recommend studying up more on this. And so when we view it this way, there's even more reason to suggest that the context is about the conduct of his ministry rather than the content of his ministry. And so again, this view supports a descriptive genitive view. Now, of course, we come to the 4th question, right? Which is the anarthros. And I said before, anarthros in the Greek just means that it is not, that it's an indefinite article, not a definite article, right? And so it's represented in most English translations with the infinitive a new covenant, right? Although a few represent it with an indefinite, the new covenant. And so John Master, who is single covenant Israel only, he suggests that the anarthros construction was used, possibly stressing quality more than identity. He says that in the new covenant issues and dispensationalism. And so if John Master is correct, again, we're assuming he is correct for the sake of argument, then this is what we would expect to find in a genitive of description as opposed to an objective. However, Larry Pettigrew counters this by claiming that it more accurately represents the Hebrew origins of Jeremiah, where God says, I will make a new covenant in verses 31 to 34. In fact, he says it favors the objective point of it. But I think that's kind of pressing the point too far, and we'll see how. And so the issue here is like, how do you take it? Do you take it as the new covenant, a new covenant? What's the significance of that in the Greek? It probably doesn't mean much, right? I think that we're probably pressing it too far than we need to, but I think it's possible it does support a descriptive genitive view, right? That's all that they're saying. So a few more considerations of this. Twice in the New Testament, Jeremiah's new covenant is referred to using the articular constructions, like Luke 22:20, 1 Corinthians 11:25. But why would Paul use the articular construction in his first epistle to the Corinthians, if Pettigrew is correct? And why would he change it up in the second, right? However, if the anarthros is used in the other three, the anarthros is used in 3 other New Covenant references, like in the book of Hebrews. Rodney Decker, who's a progressive dispensationalist, he might be more accurate when he suggests the phrase in question could just be treated as a proper name and definite, whether it's articulate or anarthros, right? So he's basically saying, bro, you guys are tripping. It doesn't matter. You're splitting hairs here, right? And so the most we can say that if the articular had been used, right? If he did say the new covenant, then it would not be referring to the quality of his ministry, but the anarthros construction allows for that possibility, right? It could possibly be that, and I think it's more likely the case when it is. And so it would basically be irrelevant to our understanding of 2 Corinthians 3, right? Now, of course, question number 5, right? You have the people going up the steps of the ladder here, the steps of success. So I'm going to show you the theological development of a typical Christian. First, you start as a lordship. You're Amil, you're Calvinist, right? You're cooked, basically. You know, you're basically R.C. Sproul at this point. Never go R.C. Sproul, you know. But then you get a little better. You're sovereign grace. You still hold the Calvinist baggage, right? You still think election is for salvation. You still think Christ didn't die for everyone. You still believe in total depravity, but at least you don't believe in perseverance, right? Like hardcore perseverance. And then you instead of being an Amil, you become a covenant premill. So we're getting a little bit better here, right? Because at least you understand Revelation 20 says 1,000 years. But then, of course, you get better. You become free grace. So you ditch Calvinism. No more Calvinism for you. It's complete trash, not exegetical. You become free grace. But then you become a progressive dispensationalist. And see, you're, again, a little bit better. You recognize church in Israel has a distinction. You recognize that you're possibly pre-trib, you know. But then you become a dispensationalist because you realize, okay, that's, progressive is not all that great, right? But then you become a single covenant multi-user, and then it's like, okay, most people stop there, okay. But then the final step is where you become single covenant Israel only, and then you're fully based, you're fully initiated. Okay. Now, what could they have known? Now, probably the most difficult hermeneutical challenge is putting yourself in the shoes of the audience. We must understand the sociology surrounding the first century Greco-Roman world, but also adjust to our own mindset as 20 to 21st century Christians. For instance, regarding the fulfillment of the new covenant, what would a first or second century believer think about it? And so, to our modern ears, right, when we're inducted in all of this covenantal language and this modern jargon, using the new covenant language when the church is not participating in it kind of sounds like absurd, right? It doesn't really make sense. But that wouldn't have been the absurd for the apostles. And so, if you think about it, they didn't really see preaching to the Gentiles as this 2,000-year long thing, right? They thought it was just like 40. They thought it was just like a year, right? Jesus is going to come back after like a year. He's going to set up the kingdom right then, right? Some of them even, it's possible they even believed that the destruction of Jerusalem was the end of the world, right? So, when Jesus spoke about the new covenant, they weren't thinking about that. And so, in fact, they probably were convinced that the kingdom was ready to come. You see that in Acts 1:6, Acts 15, 2 Thessalonians 1. Okay, using the new covenant as a metaphor to describe the conduct of a ministry would at that point seem more apropos, right, or appropriate to the situation. But now we want all those promises to be realized in the church 2,000 years later. So, I mean, the point of this is that you want to put yourself into the shoes of the apostles. What would they have thought about the kingdom, considering they didn't know when Jesus was going to come back, right? Even Paul didn't know when he's going to come back. He was convinced he was going to get raptured, at that point. And so, these are important questions to consider when you put yourself in the shoes of a first century, second century audience. And so Joyce Sims has a song called Come Into My Life. And so we're going to dive into the mind of a maniac. We're going to go into the mind of an apostle. And so if I were to transport myself 2,000 years ago to the Last Supper, I would personally, as an apostle, I would find no reason to read into the words of Christ anything about a church or parts of fulfillment or anything about what the progressives believe, right? I would just simply believe he's mentioning the establishment of the Messianic kingdom for Israel and the provision of Jeremiah 31. If I was a member of the Corinthian church by the time of 1 Corinthians 11, I would find no reason to see that I fulfilled the new covenant myself, right? If I was still a member of the church, I wasn't dead, right? I wasn't caught up in sin. I would still find no reason to be convinced of the church's participation. However, have some theologians been unwittingly influenced by the term New Testament to confirm a bias toward a view of the new covenant, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you look at the references and you don't really see any reason to consider why at that time I would think that I fulfilled the new covenant, but some people do believe that, and John Walvoord even makes a case for why we should believe that. And so the word testament and covenant, which I think is diathekis, they both use the same underlying Greek word, but Walvoord seems to push it a little bit further than expected. And so he says, from the very fact that the Bible is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament, or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, it's clear that Christianity is fundamentally based on a new covenant brought in by Jesus Christ. And so the expression for New Testament comes from the word Novum Testamentum. And for the Christian canon, it was probably first used by Tertullian or Origen in the 3rd century. However, if you go prior to this, right, 2nd century, 1st century, it was never referred to this way, right? The views of Paul and the Corinthians on the New Covenant were not influenced by the start of Novum Testamentum in the title of the scriptures, right? I don't know if our connection with the artificial division in our Bible, which technically doesn't even begin with the New Testament, it begins before Jesus even died, right? So that's a huge thing. Our beliefs about the New Covenant might be partially influenced by that, right? The idea of a New Testament, but that's more of a psychological attachment than anything, like the one Walvoord made. Now, it's probably not the case, but it is a possibility. And so then we get to the final question here. We've already noted that most references to the New Testament are eschatological or in Jewish context. So why there's a sudden switch up, right? Why does Paul now talk about it to Gentiles who don't know anything about the Old Testament? But that kind of oversimplifies things, right? That's not really the case, because in Acts 18 we see that most of the Corinthian believers came out of the Jewish synagogues. Okay, that means it probably consisted of both Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, and so in reality they would have been very well acquainted with the Hebrew Bible at that time. And he actually makes many quotations quoting directly from the law of Moses or the prophets in First and Second Corinthians. And so the general formula that Paul uses can be contrasted. And so people think, oh, well, they're Gentiles. They don't understand anything about the Old Testament. See, he's bringing it up because we're under the new covenant. Well, that's pretty simplistic. I mean, that's not really exactly what happened. I don't think that's accurate either. Now, First Corinthians references include gegraptai tar, for it is written, kathos gegraptai, just as it is written, gar, for, and Gengar to Moses nomo gegraptai, for it is written in the law of Moses, hosper gegraptai, as it is written, en to nomo gegraptai hoti, in the law it is written that, hotos kai gegraptai, thus also it is written, tote genestai hologos ha gegremenos. Then the word which was written will come to pass. Kata to gegremenon, according to what is written. Legegar, for it says, kathos epen ha theos hati, just as God said that, kathos gegreptai, just as it is written. So in comparison to First Corinthians, which uses the introductory formula 12 times, Paul only uses the formula 5 times, right? And he introduces it much less formally and usually via allusion. And so this Old Testament usage of allusion and informal reference would actually seem to fit a descriptive usage of the genitive and a metaphorical use of Jeremiah, not a fulfillment use. And so again, Paul's usage seems to support a single covenant Israel only conclusion than any other, right? So again, it's just a overview of how Paul uses the Greek and how it supports a metaphorical use rather than the fulfillment use of it. At least that would be my perspective on it. Now, conclusion. There are only two possible options when viewing the 2 Corinthians 3:6. It either demonstrates the content of his message, or it demonstrates the conduct by which he ministered the gospel. And so this author, which I'm not the author, but George Gunn is the author, and myself have argued for the latter, with robust support when we look into our 6 questions. And so taking into account all the other uses of the New Covenant in the New Testament, this conclusion fits the context best as well. Now, hopefully, you learn from this passage that this passage does not necessitate New Covenant participation in the church. And so we will continue the next part of our series, which is the book of Hebrews. So that's going to be very fun. And on that, we will go even deeper than ever, because it'll be an entire book, right? We're going to go very deep into the book of Hebrews. We're going to try to exegete it in a way that does not necessitate New Covenant participation. And hopefully you're there to see that. And so the only question I have is, any questions, right? There are obviously none, because I presented that perfectly. I presented that absolutely perfectly, right? But yeah. So this one was longer than the user ones, because this one required me to exegete a very commonly used passage. Now, if Janet's still here, who is the author? The author actually but the general editors, blood is soter, blood of the new covenant, but it's also the blood of many other things. Blood of the new covenant doesn't mean you're saved by the covenant, because the covenant is not about salvation, right? he says, when I was dispensationalist, I just ignored this verse. Well,